4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone. We have with us Mr. James Glassman as our guest today. He is the former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, to get his perspective on how this moment is playing out across both policy and perception. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Glassman. Let's dig in and know what surprised you exactly the most until now in this war between Israel and Iran. What would surprise you in the coming days or weeks, an event that you think would be unexpected or even concerning?
Well, I would say that I am surprised that Israel went ahead without direct support from the United States. That was surprising. Now, I think the way that things are unfolding, it appears that the U.S., the administration, is using the apparent success of the Israelis to push for the kind of deal that the Trump administration wanted in the first place. So this is actually helping, in a funny way, it's helping diplomacy. And so you never know what happens when the violence starts, but there's a good chance that we could get the policy objective, which is to end the Iranian program to develop a nuclear weapon.
What short-term economic consequences do you think this confrontation might cause for regional powers like Saudi Arabia or UAE and others before we move to the global and American side?
Right. So I'm not sure I would be surprised, but as you know, when conflicts start, things change from what you expect. This is very common. And so what I worry about is that this conflict drags out, and you have a long-term battle between Iran and Israel, which may have been inevitable at any rate, but this could last for a long time, and it would be very damaging to both countries. So that's what I worry about. I think the way that things are unfolding, the expectation is that we will get a resolution fairly quickly, but you never know in a war. Never know. So it's just hard to say.
What do you think the Arab world gets wrong about this? If you were advising on a narrative the Arab world should adopt, or one the United States and Israel should be pushing, what would it be?
Well, okay, so far this war has been contained. It's just these two countries fighting. So far there has been no great damage to the Iranian oil production, at least the export part of it. And so far, there has not been any kind of damage or restriction on oil flowing through the Gulf. But that can easily change. So far, there has been really not much of an impact on the global economy. I would just say this, your question about the Arab countries. So, you know, it appears to me that that the Arab countries don't want to see a large conflagration that would involve other nations. But I think they're happy to see Iran, which has been a bad actor in the Middle East, contained, let's put it that way.
What role do you think Arab countries can play in ending the war? Would it be mostly economic, or do you see a wider geopolitical contribution?
Well, I think that the Arab countries have been quietly supportive. I don't think there's any need for them to do anything else about that. I would, however, just, and this is not directly related to what's happening in Iran, but certainly tangentially, I would really like to see the Arab countries contribute to the solution in Gaza. And I think there's a chance that we can resolve a lot of the problems that have been happening in the Middle East right now. And it may be ironic because there's been so much death and destruction. But frequently after this kind of explosion, we have a period of relative calm or peace. So I do think that the Arab countries, if they can combine and show some courage and help to solve the problem in Gaza. Now, that would mean that the Israelis would have to agree to that and feel that they were comfortable about their own security. But I think that if they move into a leadership position, that would be very, very beneficial to the region.
In the framework of the war of ideas, where is Gaza? It surprised me to hear it mentioned so early, but it seems like it's central now, especially since Iran, through proxies and propaganda, always brings Palestine or Palestinian territories to the front. Can you speak to that?
Well, okay, that's a very good question. So I think it has to be two factors. It has to be a contribution to security and as well as building up the economy. To me, the solution in that part of the region is economic stability and growth for the Palestinian people. And I have to say that when I was in the Bush administration, we certainly tried that on the West Bank. We didn't get very far, and I'm very disappointed. But I do think that's the answer. And so, yes, I think that actually that Gaza could become perhaps a model for success. I think a lot of the things that President Trump said shortly after the war, the fighting started, were a little on the extreme side about the United States taking over, or, making this a haven for tourism and that sort of thing. But there was something to it. There was definitely a germ of truth, and I do believe that that part of the Middle East could be thriving, but it does require a real effort, and I think their effort is pretty much going to have to come from the Arab countries in the region. And they are in a much better position than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago when I was in government. I mean, their economies have diversified. They have generally good leadership, and they could do this. And that's certainly what I would like to see.
Over the last couple of years, economic prosperity seems to have overtaken geopolitical or moral concerns about Israel and the West Bank and Gaza in Arab thinking. Do you think that's playing a role in how the Gulf states view this conflict between Israel and Iran?
So we're at an important place in history because the Iranians have been highlighting this issue, and more than highlighting it, I think a lot of Arab countries, of course, have also highlighted the issue. I think it's important to their populations. So there's no denying that it's an important issue. But of course, the Iranians have been bad actors in this, that they have encouraged violence. They have no interest and have never had any interest in helping the people who live in Gaza become strong and thrive economically. Now, because of what's happened to their proxies, they're really in no position to make trouble in Gaza. So this is a really good opportunity. It's going to require some Israeli cooperation, but I think it is the timing is very good. There's no doubt about that.
What key economic lessons are being missed in this war, or what should we be paying more attention to?
So, as I said, I've always believed that the key to peace in the Middle East is prosperity. And that may sound strange. You'd think, one would come before the other. But I do think as people concentrate on what's really important in their own lives, they will be less agitated, let's say, about some of these other issues. And then I think as they become richer, they will certainly come back to these issues. But I do believe that prosperity comes first. And of course, you can't have prosperity if you don't have peace. So I would just say that they're linked. And one of the good things about President Trump, even though I don't agree with a lot of his foreign policy, has been that he has stressed the economic issues. And I wish he would do more to actually help to build up strong and thriving economies in especially on the West Bank, as we were trying to do in the Bush administration, and certainly in Gaza with the help of Arab countries that are now as I said, in a much better place than they were 10, 15 years ago. To not only, and it's not only a question of wealth, it's also a question of ability and understanding of the importance of markets and capital investment from the outside. I think the most important thing is that you need outside investment. You need capital to come in. So that's not going to happen until there is security. That's why I think it's so important that we solve the security problem in Gaza and in other parts of the region. And so you need security, and then you also need rule of law. And my opinion is you need democratic rule of law, but even before that, you can still have autocracies where people are reliant on the rule of law, and so that their investments are protected. So that's the foundation. And I don't think that those conditions have been met in certain parts of the region, and they need to be met. And that's an area where the United States can help. It probably can help in both areas, in the security part and the rule of law part. But that's what's really necessary now.
You have talked about Israel defense tech before, and I believe you have recommended one of the companies publicly. Based on what we've seen so far, how would you assess the performance of Israel's technological warfare tools in this war?
So the defense technology sector is changing very rapidly. And we can see what's happening in Ukraine especially. So in Ukraine, in Russia, where you really have almost like a market competition, and I don't want to trivialize, there's so many people dying in that war that really needs to end. But what you're seeing is rapid advancement in technology and war technology. And the best example, of course, is drones, where more and more drones are being used. But it's not just the fact that they're being used, it's the fact that there are defenses that have been thrown up against them. And then you find the offense working to defeat those defenses. And so, one of the best examples, of course, is that now a lot of drone warfare involves very thin wires that are attached to drones. So the drones are not free flying. They're attached to very, very thin filaments. And by doing that, the defense cannot block the radio signals, because it's not by radio, it's by wire. So, and no one could have predicted that even a year ago, 2 years ago. So there's rapid advancement. And of course, the other part of this story is what's called asymmetric warfare. So no longer is it simply a question of a country putting vast amounts of money into defense because the other side can use very, very cheap weapons to defeat it. So, the best example of that is what's happening with ballistic missiles, which are very, very expensive. They can be defeated very, very easily by weapons that are very cheap. Let's put it that way. So there are lots of things that are happening here, and I think the whole defense sector is changing. And another example, I think, is Navy is the whole Navy effort. Do we really need as many ships as we have? Are those ships very vulnerable, which they appear to be? So the point about the Navy is that in a world in which missiles are so important, naval ships are very vulnerable, and they're also very expensive. So what I just said about missiles can be defeated. That could also be true of ships. So, the aircraft carrier, which is a very, very expensive weapon, is now much more vulnerable than it ever has been. Now, the United States is using a carrier group in the Mediterranean as a potential, both a defensive and offensive weapon, and potential, I say, in this war between Iran and Israel. I think if the United States enters the war, that carrier group will become very important for projecting power.
Is this a statement to the strength of the private sector in Israel's defense industry, in contrast to countries where defense is fully state-run? How important is that dynamic?
Yes, so that's a very good question. The answer is yes. It is a private sector success. The government has a lot to say about what weapons are developed and how long a program is going to last, and how it will be funded, of course. But in the United States, what we're seeing, especially with smaller companies, is the development of very innovative weapons. So, these companies have to be a tool of the government. They have to work with the government very closely. But absolutely, these private sector companies, you can see that in Israel, and you can see it in the United States, and we're seeing it in Europe as well. We're seeing it in Germany, in France, in many other countries. And the other thing I would say is that we're also finding, and this has been true throughout history, but it's very important now, that commercial developments in technological innovation are being translated, of course, into weapons. And that's certainly, we're going to see that with AI. We're already seeing it with advanced microchips. And I would add one more thing, because I just read a very good article about this in The Economist. China is doing a phenomenal job with drones. So China is way ahead of everyone in drones, and they are using drones in commercial settings. So drones are being used to deliver people's lunch orders in China, thousands and thousands of times a day, which is kind of amazing. It's not happening in the United States. To my knowledge, it's not happening anywhere. And one of the reasons is the Chinese government has decided that drones are absolutely a top priority, the development of drone technology. But after that, the government tends to step away and let the private sector develop these drones in a very innovative way. And I think that's a good model. The Chinese, they're ahead. So it's a centralized system to set priorities. And then from there, the private sector has a relative amount of freedom to go ahead and come up with ideas, with new ideas within that context.
What lessons do you think centralized economies like Egypt's should take from Israel's model?
Yes, I think that's a very important observation. These countries, no country in the world is going to get very far by having government direction, complete government direction, government industries, or so much government control that there can't be innovation. And the Chinese seem to have done a pretty good job of combining government, not direction, but prioritization, saying these are the important things that we need to focus on. And, that's generally called industrial policy. And I think too much of it is bad. And I worry that we're having too much of it in the United States. The Biden administration began that, but the Trump administration has ratcheted it up. It's even worse. But in general, the United States does allow a great deal of freedom in the private sector. But that is absolutely necessary. That strict control over industry is not going to get a country very far at all. So I would definitely advise Egypt to free up its private sector.
The oil sector is another dimension of this. Worst case scenario, if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, what do you think happens next?
Well, I think there are certain things that could bring the United States into this war, and that would be one. The United States is not going to allow a closing of the Straits of Hormuz.
Even if Hormuz isn't closed, we've seen oil prices rise quickly. I once read that $10 on the price of oil equals half a point increase in interest rates due to inflation. Would you talk about how this war is affecting oil prices and what that means for the global economy?
The United States is not going to allow a closure of the Straits of Hormuz. That would bring the U.S. into this war. There's no doubt about that. So it remains important. In a way, you think that's a kind of antiquated, old school problem. The idea that there's one geographical area that's so important, but it is, and it will remain that way. So that needs to be, the Straits of Hormuz need to be kept open for shipping of oil. Yes.
You mentioned the United States is the top oil producer now, and that Iran only supplies 3% globally. Could you expand on that analysis? What else should people understand here?
So far, we've seen oil prices go up, but they've come back down a little bit. There's no panic in oil markets because Iran won't be able to export. Iran is 3% of total oil capacity or volume, let's say, in production volume in the world. So it's important, but it's not, it's not all that critical. Also, we now have the United States as a major factor, which we did not have, during the 1970s, during the oil embargo. So the United States is the number one producer of oil in the world, and it can't. It's an important factor. Let's put it that way. It's not everything, but it's an important factor. So I don't think that oil is as important, or the threats of cutting off oil is as important as it used to be. So there has been a major change in the world of oil over the last 10 or 20 years, mainly because the U.S. adopted a new technology for drilling and enabled the U.S. as well as other countries to extract oil from areas that were very difficult before, very expensive to extract. Now you also have in this administration a president who is removing a lot of the constraints on developing oil, for example, on federal land. There's a lot of federal land owned by the government in the United States. So the Secretary of Energy was recently in Alaska talking about how there's going to be more land that's opened up to drilling. But that's in the future. Right now, the United States is the number one producer of oil in the world. The difference between the U.S., however, and Saudi Arabia is Saudis have enormous reserves that they can call on. The United States at this point, we have reserves, but we have to. It's harder for us to drill for the oil. In other words, it's just going to take longer. But I think in general, the world is in a better place than it was before. You can imagine even 20 years ago, if there's a war in Russia, which is a major oil producer, and then there's a war in Iran, that would spike oil prices to, I think, the equivalent of over $100 a barrel today. And right now, last time I looked, we're $72 a barrel, which is actually fine. I mean, oil needs to be at a level that's high enough so the oil producers continue to drill. And that tends to be $65 to $75 a barrel, maybe $80 a barrel. We don't want to see it much higher than that. So it's actually been in a good position. So I'm not too worried about the oil situation.
Beyond water and oil tech, what other economic lessons do you think this war is highlighting? For example, Western markets are often risk averse. Are there broader takeaways about balancing short-term fears with long-term strategy?
Yes, I do, and I think it's somewhat disturbing. So this war, as well as the war that Russia started against Ukraine, are the kinds of wars that are, I think, surprising in a post-World War II context. Because generally, we certainly have had wars, of course, but we haven't had, especially the one that's happening now in Ukraine, where one country is invading another. We did have Iraq invading Kuwait, but this is a massive invasion by the Russians. And generally, we don't want to settle our problems through warfare. And so what's happened with the Russians invading Ukraine is, in a way, they've broken, let's call it a taboo. And what we don't want to have happen is that they've normalized this kind of activity. Now, I think that what's happening between Israel and Iran is a little bit different, because this is a problem that has been festering for 20 years or longer. And it was pretty clear that it had to be resolved one way or another. Now, I wish it had been resolved diplomatically, but it needed some kind of resolution. So that's a little bit different, but still, if this develops into something much larger, I worry about that because of what I call a normalization of that kind of warfare. So because of what the Russians did in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent, the Israeli attack on Iran, it may be more likely that we will see China do something against Taiwan, just because it's been normalized. We haven't had this kind of thing in a long time. So that's something I worry about. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with economics, but it's something I do worry about.
Where economics meets policymaking, what key lessons should U.S. national security or defense leadership be thinking about right now?
Let me just shift gears, if that's okay, because I think we're seeing something else that is also a violation of norms. And that is what the United States has been doing with tariffs. So I feel, surprisingly enough, that this is all of one piece. That we've had norms that have been accepted by most of the world since the end of World War II, and they're now being violated in some cases in an extreme way. So as I said, there's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. By the same token, the world has been moving, in some cases very slowly, but generally in the right direction, for the last 80 years when it comes to economics, when it comes to free trade, the ability of one nation to trade with another. And we have pulled down average tariff rates down to just a few percentage points globally. And now we have a president who wants to change that in a very radical way. Now, the markets have responded in such a negative way that the president has had to back off, but I don't think that he's finished. So we're going to see something important that's coming up just in the next few weeks, where, if you remember, President Trump 2 months ago said, here are the tariff rates for every country in the world, and we're going to delay them until early July, but then we're going to enforce them. Well, we'll see whether he does enforce them. But if he does, this would be, in my opinion, just disastrous for the world. But we don't know whether it's going to happen. But even the fact he's raising this, it's again a violation of what we expect, what has been the norm. And I really worry about that. And it would have a deep effect on Arab nations. There's no doubt about that. Deep effect. Again, we don't know whether he's going to go through with it or not, but it would really be a problem.
Some in the Arab world say Iran is using this war to create inflation and market panic, hoping the United States will pressure Israel to stop. Do you think that theory holds any water, or is it just wishful thinking?
So first of all, I don't think that the war in Iran is going to have an effect on inflation. I don't think so. I mean, it may raise oil prices a little bit, but I don't think they're going to go much over $80 a barrel. So I don't think that's an issue. It's a little complicated, but in my own view, people have talked about how tariffs will cause inflation. I actually don't think that's true. I think what tariffs do is cause the opposite, which is recession. I think there is a chance that if we have tariffs at the levels, or even close to the levels, that the Trump administration wants, that we will have a global downturn in growth and maybe recession. So that's what I think is more worrisome. So think about this. Tariffs cause companies to raise their prices because they have to pay more to get their goods in the hands of people abroad. But on the other hand, those people don't have to buy those goods. The people can say, well, those prices are too high. We can't pay them. And so what happens is production declines, sales decline, and you potentially have a recession. And we can look to the Great Depression, because in the Great Depression, there was this thing called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which were the biggest tariffs that were ever applied by the United States up to now. And what was the effect of those tariffs? It was not inflation. It was, in fact, deflation. Prices went down, but the economy went down. So it didn't help anybody. So people couldn't pay for anything, and the unemployment went to 25%. So I'm not saying that same kind of thing is going to happen, but I am saying that it's more likely we'll see an economic slowdown than we would see higher prices. But as far as the war that's going on now in Iran, I don't think that's going to cause inflation.
The idea is that Trump, for example, would get nervous about inflation and push Israel to stand down. Does that seem likely to you?
So I completely disagree with that. So first of all, you have an administration that has shown that it is a U.S. administration, that it's more isolationist than any administration that we've had since before World War II. This administration has been very clear that it does not want to be involved in wars. It wants to end wars. Now, I think a lot of that is naive and probably wrong as far as what the role of the United States in the world is. But I don't think this administration wants to dominate the Middle East. That is not their interest. As far as the Israelis are concerned, you know, I take as accurate what they have said for decades, which is they just want security. And so I don't think they want to conquer any territory. They've done pretty well with what they have, and there's plenty of room for other people to live there. They just have a serious security problem, and that's what, they want to resolve that now. You can certainly argue that they have not done they certainly haven't achieved it, and maybe they've gone about it the wrong way. But I don't think that they want dominance in the Middle East. I think from let's say from an economic point of view, there's no doubt that the United States, that there are companies and people in the United States that would like to invest in the Middle East. They see that as, in a way, kind of the promised land. That's an area that has been very short of investment, and they would like to invest. Both Americans and Israelis. And that's one of the good things about the Abraham Accords that we've already seen. There has been cross investment, between the Gulf countries and Israel in both directions. So that's a really good model. So that's the way I see what's happening in the region.
Could Iran ever be part of the Abrahamic Accords? Is that completely off the table or something to imagine?
Yes, one can dream that, and certainly the Iranian people, the Persian people have a great tradition of culture and business and development, but they've essentially for the last 50 years been in a condition of worse than stasis. They've been they've been bad actors in the world. So I don't know when that's going to change, but certainly if it does change, we will see real prosperity in Iran. There's no reason not to have that kind of prosperity, given the energetic and culturally rich nature of the Iranian people. But for now, no. I think Iran will be, unless something happens with its government, is going to be a pariah nation. And the Arab countries have a very good chance to be tremendously successful. And I think that, again, just to go back to what I was saying in the beginning, I think that success from an economic point of view will lead to the kind of stability that we've seen, we've seen after World War II in Europe and most of Asia. And we want to see that in the Middle East as well. But to me, this is not a question of Israelis wanting to dominate these countries. I mean, you can say, oh yeah, the Israelis, they'd like to be investing in these countries, but and that's the direction I think that they're moving in. And yes, they need security, but beyond that, no.
You have an interesting comparison to the post-World War II economic boom. Could this current phase, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, be a dark chapter that leads to something economically transformative in the region?
Yes, I do. And I don't think that is, I don't think that's naive optimism. I think that we can look at history for that. Now, it took a while for Europe, which was ravaged by war in a way that the Middle East has not, to recover. I mean, it took probably 15 years, in some cases only really about a decade. But so maybe we should think that it could happen very quickly. But yes, frequently in the wake of wars, and we see growth. We saw that in France in the late 19th century after the terrible war of 1870. We see it over and over throughout history. And so, yes, I do think that can happen in the Middle East. And not only that, but we've seen throughout history that if there is a serious economic downturn, this incites and causes more geopolitical turmoil. So it's no accident that World War II started on the heels of a Great Depression. So we have to watch that.
Technology of warfare.
Huge advances in technology warfare. There's a revolution.
Will the regime fall?
Iran is in deep trouble. Deep trouble. Question for Iran is, will the regime fall? I think there's a greater chance of the regime falling than ever in history, and than ever in the last 50 years. That's not necessarily, that could lead to some real turmoil. But yes, I think there's a very good chance.
Should Saudi Arabia take a leadership role in solving the Gaza issue after the war?
Take a leadership role in solving the problem in Gaza post-war.
Mohammed bin Zayed, UAE.
My message is the same. I really think that now is a critical moment for you to step up and get involved and solve the problem of post-war Gaza.
Jordan.
My message is the same to Jordan. Jordan is not a rich country, but Jordan has a good reputation, has shown leadership in the past, and needs to be a leader in solving the problem of post-war Gaza.
Benjamin Netanyahu.
You have taken advantage of the weakness of your enemies. You've been bold. Now is the time to show magnanimity.
Young Arabs, or the youth of the Arab world.
You are the future. You are the future. And I've always been impressed by young Arabs. I really would say that this is the time for you to turn to the kinds of economic activities that will cause the region to grow and thrive.
The new leadership in Syria.
The new leadership in Syria is moving in the right direction. We need to keep a close eye on it, and you have a great opportunity.
Iraq.
What comes to mind with Iraq is Iraq could have a very important leadership position in the region. You have to cut all of your ties with Iran. It's very clear that the direction that Iran is moving in, and you need to move much closer to Arab nations and as well as to the United States.
What should the world learn from what's happening in the region right now?
I think the big lesson that the world needs to learn from the Middle East is that you can't direct an economy from the top. You can set priorities, but you need to have a thriving middle class and economic growth.
China.
China is much farther ahead in technological areas than the rest of the world seems to acknowledge. And the United States is making a big mistake in trying to constrain Chinese imports of T-shirts and medical supplies and toys. The rest of the world really needs to compete in a serious way with China, because China is just moving ahead like crazy. The United States is making a big mistake with these tariffs. I think that is a major threat to the world. That if we are to impose tariffs of 20 or 25% on imports to the United States, there will be a massive trade war. Other countries will respond. Right now, that has been postponed because of the way that markets have operated. And the president does not want to, the president is very attuned to markets, but if he is allowed to do what he really wants to do, it would be terrible for the world economy.
Will Iran close the Strait of Hormuz?
No, Iran will not close the Strait of Hormuz because I think Iran does not want to bring the United States into this war.
Any final thoughts? Something I didn't ask, but you think should be said?
Thank you very much. And thank you. I just want to thank MBN and you for carrying on in a very difficult situation. You know, I have to say I apologize for it, even though I can't take responsibility for it. But it's a terrible thing, and I hope that you emerge, you know, stronger than ever.
Thank you for being with us, Mr. Glassman, and thank you for watching. Until next time.